Good morning and welcome to the workshop on the vulnerability assessment of critical medicines. I am Monica Dias. I'm the head of supply and availability of medicines and devices at EMA and also chair of the SPOC working party. And I'm going to co-chair this workshop with my colleague Charles Denon from the Belgium agency. Charles, please.
Good morning to you all. I'm Charles Denon, head of the International Relations Division of the Belgian Agency for Medicines. Some of you might already know me because I've been quite active at different levels on the issue of critical medicines since the Belgian presidency in 2024. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. So, on the behalf of the European Medicines Agency and also the MSSG, I would like to thank you for your availability at short notice to join this workshop on vulnerability assessment that is progressing under the Executive Steering Group on Shortages and Safety of Medicinal Products, the MSSG. Now, strengthening the resilience of supply chains of critical medicines is a key priority for the EMA, but also for national competent authorities, so for the European Medicines Regulatory Network. And this is in particular because of the increased complexity of medicine shortages in recent years. There is a shift from reactive to more preventive measures to address supply challenges, aiming to minimize their impact and, whenever possible, to prevent shortages. The vulnerability assessment that we will discuss today aims to provide a structured approach to identify and better understand where vulnerabilities lie in critical medicines to inform both industrial and regulatory policy measures. Especially today, we will discuss the data requests that you will receive next week and the data that you will be required to share with EMA and the MSSG as the first set of marketing authorization holders to be part of the vulnerability assessment in anticipation of the new pharma legislation and the proposed Critical Medicines Act. Now, you as marketing authorization holders play a central role in informing this work as the entities responsible for ensuring secure and continued supply of medicines. Your experience and your feedback are essential to ensure that the planned approach is both effective and proportionate. We hope this discussion will support a shared understanding of the objectives of this exercise and help refine the process as we move forward to implementing the upcoming legislation to strengthen the security of supply of critical medicines for patients across the Union. You have been invited to this meeting because you are responsible for a medicine under one of the 19 INNs that will be included in the first set of vulnerability assessments that will be carried out this year. Now, in advance of the meeting, you will have received the relevant materials, the vulnerability assessment methodology, details of the INNs in scope, and a template that will be the basis of the formal data request you will receive next week to start this exercise. So now I would like to go through some housekeeping information rules. So the first one is that to avoid confusion and background noise, your microphones are switched off and cannot be turned on. Also, I would like to highlight to you that this event is being recorded and will subsequently be published in the EMA website. And now if we move to the next slide, I would like to hand over to Charles and he's going to take us through the agenda for today's workshop. Charles, over to you.
Thank you, Monica. Today, after 3 keynote speeches aimed at describing the objective of this vulnerability assessment work, we will have 2 interactive sessions, first on the methodology and next on the assessment of a first set of 19 INNs. Next slide, please. Your engagement will be very important during the workshop and you will be able to interact through Slido. If you would like to ask a question, please raise it through Slido and wait for the interactive sessions. Multiple choice questions will also be asked in the first and second interactive sessions. Your interactions via Slido is voluntary and you may opt to remain anonymous. If you choose to use Slido, you consent to the processing of your personal data as explained in the EMA Data Protection Notice for WebEx. The Q&A is already open and questions can be sent anytime in Slido on any of the presentations. Considering the expected high volume of questions, not all questions will be answered during the workshop. All questions will be answered in the Q&A documents, which will be published on the EMA website together with the recording. Next slide, please. Here you can scan the QR code or join via slido.com with the session code #vulnerability. We'll give you a moment now to connect, and I'll pass the floor to Monica to take you through the first agenda point. Monica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles. So we move now to the first agenda point, the key objectives. And now we'll have key interventions from the MSSG co-chairs and from the European Commission. So now I'll pass the floor to the European Medicines Agency Executive Director and co-chair of the MSSG, Emma Cook, to offer some insights into the work that has been carried out in anticipation of the upcoming legislation under the MSSG and the expectations for this vulnerability exercise. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Monica, and thank you, Charles. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. And I really want to thank everybody who has come here to join us in this discussion and help us make supply chains better across Europe and globally. So first of all, on behalf of EMA and the MSSG, I would like to welcome marketing authorization holders and industry association representatives to today's event, which, as you know, is dedicated to vulnerability assessments. Now, I don't need to tell you that medicine shortages remains one of our most pressing challenges facing healthcare systems across Europe and indeed globally. And in recent years, we've seen firsthand how disruptions in global manufacturing, supply chains, and geopolitical changes can rapidly translate into shortages that directly affect patients and healthcare professionals. And of course, in recent weeks, we've seen another pertinent example of fragility and uncertainty that we need to be prepared for in the future. So ensuring reliable availability of medicines calls for collaboration and shared commitment across the entire pharmaceutical ecosystem. And this is precisely what the vulnerability assessment tries to do. It represents an important step in how we collectively shift from a reactive approach to a preventive approach. And the objective is straightforward, but it's also quite ambitious. We want to try and identify vulnerabilities in the supply chain of critical medicines before they translate into shortages, and also to use the information gathered during the assessment to inform both regulatory and industrial policy measures, which are provided for under the new pharmaceutical legislation and the proposed Critical Medicines Act. So by working with you, we aim to better understand where risks exist, whether in manufacturing concentration, availability of active substances, limited production capacity, or dependencies on single suppliers. For this initiative to succeed, it depends fundamentally on the quality and reliability of the data that we have. And I cannot stress this enough. I want to emphasize the importance of your commitment to provide data to the European Medicines Agency. So this exercise seeks to gather realistic information on supply capacity, demand coverage, and production resilience. And the data points that we've identified will allow us to draw meaningful conclusions on the robustness of supply chains and the potential exposure of certain medicines to supply disruption. And without credible and committed supply data, vulnerability assessments cannot deliver the insights needed to guide action. So we need your engagement. We need you to provide the data. This is not simply a reporting exercise. It is a critical contribution to building a shared understanding of supply resilience across the European Union. And I want to also stress that the purpose of the exercise is not purely analytical. It is about informing recommendations. It's about helping us make recommendations, be it from the MSSG or from industrial policy actors, where we can identify possibly regulatory tools that can help strengthen supply security or industrial policy interventions. As you know, we already have several mechanisms in place across the European medicines regulatory network that support resilience. And for example, we have the possibility of regulatory flexibilities. We have the possibility to accelerate procedures for manufacturing changes. We have improved coordination on shortage management, and we have the potential to have targeted enhanced regulatory cooperation across member states. But to deploy these tools effectively to address structural supply chain issues, we need evidence, we need data, and we need to understand where vulnerabilities lie and where interventions can make the greatest difference. So this is what the exercise is trying to achieve. And today's discussion is extremely important as an opportunity to clarify expectations, to explain how the process will work, and more importantly, to engage directly with you, the companies that ultimately manage and maintain these supply chains that are so important for European citizens. So we greatly appreciate the time and effort that your participation will require, but I must stress that the outcome will benefit us all. It will benefit regulators, it will benefit industry, health systems, and most importantly, patients. Secure supply of medicines is a shared responsibility. By working together to make vulnerability assessments work, we can take a significant step forward towards a more resilient medicine supply chain, supply system in Europe. So thank you for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to our further collaboration on this important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emer. So now I will pass the floor to Karl Broich, who is the MSSG co-chair and president of the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, the BfArM in Germany, to expand on the MSSG's ambition, but also to share his views on how this work will be used at national level by the member states. So, Karl, over to you.
Thank you, Monica, and good morning to everyone, and thank you for being here today. It's a great pleasure to join Emer Cook and Rainer Becker in opening this important workshop. As Emer has outlined, this initiative gives us a more preventive framework for looking at vulnerabilities in the supply chains of critical medicines. From the perspective of member states, the crucial question is what this means in practice for patient care and for health systems. For member states, medicine shortages are not an abstract issue. They are daily operational reality for healthcare professionals, for hospitals, for pharmacies, and above all, for the patients. When shortages occur, member states are the ones who see the immediate consequences in clinical practice and in the organization of care. So we see the pressure on substitution, we see pressure on procurement, we see the pressure on communication with healthcare professionals and patients. And we see how quickly a supply issue can become a public health issue. That is why this work is such a priority for the European Medicines Regulatory Network. For us, the value of the vulnerability assessment is therefore very practical. It helps us identify where risks to supply security may be building up before they translate into shortages that affect patient care. And it helps us understand where coordinated action may be needed most. It also connects to a broader European discussion on how to strengthen the resilience of supply chains for critical medicines in the current geopolitical situation. In that sense, this work is not only relevant for immediate preparedness, but also for longer-term thinking about supply security here in Europe. This is especially important for critical medicines. In many cases, the vulnerabilities we face do not result from the one isolated event. They reflect structural fragilities that have developed over time. That is concentration of manufacturing, limited diversification, and dependencies on very few suppliers or production sites. From a member state perspective, the central question is simple. Where are the vulnerabilities that could most seriously affect patients and health system if disruption occurs? Because that is what determines where preparedness matters most, where resilience must be strengthened, and where attention should be focused first. This is why the assessment of vulnerability is so valuable. It gives us a better basis for prioritization, for preparedness, and for coordinated action at both the European and the national level. And that is also why today's workshop matters so much. Today is about creating a shared understanding of the methodology, the timelines, the data elements that companies will be asked to provide for the first set of products. It is also about having an open exchange on how this process can work well in practice from the very beginning. Let me say just one word about the role of industry. Your participation is really essential because this exercise depends on realistic and reliable information. But I would put it this way. Good information is not only useful for us as regulators. It is what allows all of us to move from general concern to targeted action where it is really needed. So the main message I would like to leave with you today is this. For member states, this work is about protecting patient care. It is about seeing vulnerabilities earlier, and it is about using that knowledge to support timely and coordinated action. Ultimately, our objective is a simple one: to ensure that critical medicines remain available for patients across Europe when they need them. That requires our close cooperation between regulators, member states, the European Commission, and US industry. And that is why today's exchange is so important. It helps build a common understanding, a common evidence base, and a stronger foundation for our action at the MSSG in the future. So thank you very much. I look forward to today's discussion and the results of the workshop.
Thank you very much, Carl. So now, finally, under this agenda point, I welcome Rainer Becker, Director for Medical Products and Innovation at the European Commission, DG Sante. Rainer, we look forward to hearing about the Commission's ambition and also some insights into the intricacies of the upcoming legislation, both the new pharma legislation and the proposed Critical Medicines Act on this topic. So over to you, Rainer.
Thank you very much, Monica. And actually, while we're speaking, there's a debrief from the last trilogue on the CMA right now in Coreper that I'm missing because I really wanted to be here with you and wish you, first of all, a good morning and a welcome from here, the team in the Commission and DG Santé working on shortages. We as public authorities have a number of tasks and also legal obligations to help ensuring the availability of medicines, especially critical medicines. I'm not only thinking here about the CMA, very important tool, but also obligations on us as public authorities under the pharma regulation. Just finalized. Now the text is stable, it's going into translation, and it will then in due course, I think it's after the summer, we'll get the last finishing signatures and then be published in the OJ. And some of those legal obligations, especially those concerning the availability of medicines, shortages, that chapter, it will enter into force immediately. So these are obligations to set up and update the union list of critical medicines, or the obligation to carry out a vulnerability analysis to better know where to support, where to really look for measures, as Carl mentioned, or where to take measures under the CMA, for example, to strengthen manufacturing capacity in the EU. Really, I'm thinking about very wide-ranging support, which also could include financial support for manufacturing capacity over here in EU member states, or when really to activate the special rules under public procurement for vulnerable critical medicines. So we have a number of tasks as public authorities which we will have to do and which we'll be very happy to do, because this is serving a very important and a very good purpose. Companies supplying medicines to the health systems in the EU member states, on which these count and rely, have in the first place a certain social or moral responsibility, if you want, to organize the supply in a way that is indeed reliable. And that responsibility vis-a-vis society is particularly strong, obviously, for critical medicines, but not only. And therefore, no one should be surprised that the new pharmaceutical regulation that, as I said, will come into force later this year, second half this year, also has some legal responsibilities concerning the supply and the supply chains of companies for medicines. And these are precisely those legal rules of the pharma package that will not wait for this 2-year transition period for all the rest of the package, but really, as we are talking about a really urgent matter, they have been deemed by the legislator, the co-legislator, European Parliament and the Council, member states, as so important and so urgent that they will enter into force 20 days after publication of the formal regulation in the official journal, which should be sometime Q3, Q4 this year. So, and these are responsibilities on measures to help ensuring resilient supply chains, but also legal responsibilities with obligations to help the public authorities to fulfill our legal obligations, for instance, to carry out the vulnerability analysis for critical medicines. And indeed, so the pharma regulation does contain obligation, and they are directly applicable and directly legally binding. Legally binding means with an obligation to really execute what is asked. So if there is a need to supply to the MSSG, to the EMA, information to undertake the vulnerability analysis, that information and be it confidential information needs to be supplied with appropriate safeguards, guarantees that confidential remains absolutely confidential. But there really will be the obligation to supply the information. And legal obligations with all that goes with it, also the mandate for the public authorities to ensure compliance. But we don't want to go there. We are reaching out. We have been reaching out, and here now, especially with this workshop, to make this a joint and collaborative and mutually supportive effort. And that's why I'm so happy to see so many of you engaging in this workshop and attending, and hope and count on you all to keep this up and really make this, as I said, a mutually supportive effort to gather the data and to really make sure that we can make the good analysis with it. And when I say we, I talk about the public authorities as a whole. It's not, don't worry, it will not go to DG Santé. When I say guaranteed to be confidential, it will really be on a need-to-know basis only. So any information supplied will be really very strictly protected. I was saying that I see this as a joint effort, and by that I mean that we want to be as helpful, all of us on the public side, as helpful as we can to facilitate you providing the data that is indispensable, as EMA explained, for the vulnerability analysis. And we also want to really help today in the workshop, but also going forward, help and guide where it may not be quite so obvious for some companies to provide certain points of the data that are actually needed, certain pieces of information. We also want to be helpful by front-loading in a staggered approach a small group of priority INNs to help us all get prepared and hit the ground running when actually the legal obligations are becoming legally binding later in the year. And we really want to make this a joint effort and also a joint success in delivering the legally requirement vulnerability analysis. And let's not forget, this vulnerability analysis is required, not least, to really unlock the benefits of the Critical Medicine Act. That, and I didn't say that yet, but I am still very confident that we will conclude this and it will become a adopted legal act, so move out of the decision later this year. So with that, looking very much forward, happy to answer any questions that you may have, but very much forward to this workshop today and also going forward. As I said, it's a joint challenge. It will require a joint effort, but it can also really be a joint success. So with that, very much looking forward to this workshop.
Thank you so much, Rainer. And thank you all, so also Emer and Carl, for providing and highlighting the objective of the work and also the legislation that will soon come. I think just from your interventions, it is clear that we all have a role to play in progressing this work and ensuring that the outcomes make really a tangible difference to ensure secure and continued supply of medicines for European patients and healthcare systems. So I propose that we are actually right on time, just a few minutes ahead of schedule, and we can move to the next agenda point. So I will pass the floor back to Charles to introduce the first technical presentation. Charles, over to you.
Thank you, Monica. Can you go to the next slide, please? In anticipation, and Rainer rightly said, it's all about anticipation of the upcoming legislation. The MSSG established a dedicated working group to progress on this topic. I am a member of that working group, and before that, I was an active participant in discussions in the European Commission's Critical Medicine Alliance. I see the value in a collaborative and coordinated approach at EU level, and I welcome MSSG's approach to take the work of the Alliance and the previous work done by DG ERA into account when finalizing this methodology. The involvement of stakeholders is essential, and the feedback from industry associations has been very important in sharpening the methodology that Athanasios Lapatinas will now describe. In this first technical presentation, Thanos will provide an overview of the MSSG adopted methodology and the governance under MSSG to ensure that all participants are familiar before we move to the data request. Thanos, floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to all. I will go to the next slide directly. So let me start by briefly setting the context and highlighting again the legal basis for this work. It was already presented and highlighted. Can you see the slides? Yes, no? Okay. So, and highlight again, as I said, the legal basis for this work. So this is important because it also explains why we are asking for this data, why we're asking for the data for this exercise. So as it was already mentioned, under the new pharmaceutical legislation, EMA is required to develop a common methodology to assess, to evaluate vulnerabilities in supply chains. And at the same time, the MSSG is tasked with actually carrying out these vulnerability assessments for critical medicines in the Union list. In addition, there are related provisions under the proposed Critical Medicines Act, as it was already said, which also rely on having a clear and evidence-based understanding of supply chain vulnerabilities. So the data that we are requesting is directly linked to these legal requirements. Now, in terms of what has been done so far, the MSSG has set up a dedicated working group to take this work forward. So as Charles was saying, we take this work forward building on what already exists at EU and national level. And this group has developed the vulnerability assessment methodology with input also from industry associations. And this methodology was adopted by MSSG in November 25 and is now publicly available on the EMA website. So we have also identified a set of priority substances, a set of priority INNs that we will be presented later, where the methodology will be applied this year. And finally, this workshop is part of that process. So it's part of a process to inform marketing authorization holders, to inform you and explain what is expected and ensure there is support throughout this exercise. So we will provide support for you and for the data collection throughout the exercise, and we will also share feedback once the exercise is completed. So overall, this is a structured, a legally grounded process, and today is really about making sure we move forward in a clear way and with good, I would say, collaboration. Now, the objective of this work is very clearly, let's say, outcome focused. So we have really tangible outcomes. So it's not an academic exercise. First, under the new pharmaceutical legislation, the methodology is designed to directly support MSSG recommendations. So the outputs of this exercise will give the MSSG a structured, as I said, evidence-based basis to issue guidance and recommendations that are consistent across the EU network. And second, and very importantly, the methodology directly supports the Critical Medicines Act. The Act states explicitly that measures should be justified and proportionate, and it requires demonstrating that a specific measure addresses a concrete vulnerability in the supply chain of a critical medicine in the Union list, and that is exactly what the vulnerability analysis is designed to do. Now, based on the outcomes of the methodology, the results can inform where financial incentives or strategic projects are most relevant, allowing member states to prioritize support for projects that really address identified supply chain vulnerabilities. And it can also support procurement-related measures, for example, where there is clear dependency on third countries. And in such cases, procurement approaches can be used to promote diversification of suppliers, or in specific situations to favor suppliers with manufacturing capacity in the EU. And the same evidence can support Commission procurement on behalf of member states, or even joint procurement initiatives where a vulnerability has been clearly identified on, or when the MSSG recommends a common approach. Finally, besides individual measures, the outputs of the methodology can help inform discussions in the Critical Medicines Coordination Group, supporting strategic orientation, cooperation, and coordination of EU-level activities. So overall, the key message is that this methodology, the methodology that we are presenting today, is not, as I said, an academic exercise. It is designed to provide very practical, very evidence-based outputs that directly support decision-making under the new pharmaceutical legislation, under the Critical Medicines Act, and under the broader EU governance framework of critical medicines. Now, as I said before, the vulnerability assessment methodology didn't start from zero. It builds on several years of work at the EU level. And I would say that it began in 2021 with a Commission structured dialogue on medicine supply, which mapped, let's say, the first set of structural weaknesses. This was followed by the 2022 staff working document and the 2023 Commission communication, which made shortages and resilience a clear, let's say, political priority. A major milestone came in June 2024 with the first technical report on supply chain vulnerabilities for 11 molecules, for 11 substances from the Union list of critical medicines. And this report was produced jointly by DG HERA and by DG GROW. And I would say it gave us the first structure assessment of dependencies and structural risks. Now, in February 2025, the strategic report of the Critical Medicines Alliance further refined the approach, and it gave us, let's say, more concrete recommendations, both on vulnerability drivers, so what drives risks, what are the risk drivers, and also on the type of policy measures that might be needed to address these vulnerabilities. And now we have two important legislative milestones. It was already mentioned in the key objectives, in the key speeches, the proposed pharmaceutical legislation which formally mandates EMA and member states to develop and apply the methodology, and the Critical Medicines Act, which will set the framework for how vulnerabilities should be addressed in practice. So I would say that overall, the methodology is based on several years of analysis, on several years of evidence, on several years of consultation, and in a way, it is the natural continuation and consolidation of all this work, of all these milestones that you see, that you can see in this slide. Now, our starting point for the methodology is, of course, the Union List of Critical Medicines. So the current version, 2.1, published on the EMA website. You can find it published on the website. It includes 285 active substances. Across the EU market, I would say that these 285 substances translate into close to 19,000 medicinal products, with a significant share of around 95% being nationally authorized products. So we are dealing with a large and, I would say, very heterogeneous landscape. And maybe just to recall how we arrived at the Union List, the initial screening covered a high number of active substances, more than 2,200 substance groups and combinations. And then member states were asked to evaluate the criticality of these substances based on two criteria. The first criterion was the therapeutic importance, and the second criterion was the availability of alternatives. Now, this process resulted in the final set of the 285 INNs, which is now the core set of substances, the core set of molecules for which we will apply the vulnerability assessment methodology that I will present in the next slides. And I need to highlight something important here, that the vulnerability assessment does not redefine this list. So we're not remake this list. We're not redefining this list. We build on this list, and we look for the vulnerabilities of the critical medicines of the supply chains in this union list. Now, before going into the details of the methodology, I would like to explain how we will walk through the methodology. So how I will present the methodology, I would say. I will take a backwards approach. So I will start by showing you how we see the implementation in practice. Then I will present what the final outputs will look like. So I would like to present to you the reports, the final reports. After that, I will go one step back and explain the key elements of the methodology that allow us to produce these outputs. And finally, I will go into the indicators and the data we need, which will also link to the data template that I will present in the next session. So starting with the implementation, this slide is about the implementation. The first step is data collection. So we would like to gather information from you, from marketing authorization holders, on supply chains and on potential risks. Then we apply the methodology, and we apply the methodology to identify two types of vulnerabilities. The first are structural vulnerabilities. These are long-term weaknesses in how the supply chain is organized. For example, as it was said before, strong dependency on a single supplier, on a single site, on a single region. These types of vulnerabilities, I would say, that usually require long-term structural actions, long-term industrial policies. Now, the second, let's say, classification of vulnerabilities are what we call conditional vulnerabilities. Here, the supply chain might be generally stable, so the structure might be stable. We might have a good structure of supply chains, but it may become vulnerable under certain conditions. For example, we might have vulnerabilities during demand spikes or temporary disruptions. These can often be addressed with let's say short to medium-term policy measures and interventions. Finally, all this analysis feeds into a report. A final outcome of this exercise will be a report where we clearly describe the vulnerabilities that we have identified. And these reports are prepared at the level of the active substance and pharmaceutical form. which is also how the union list of critical medicines is structured and how the union list is reported. So we want to be consistent on how we report the findings of this exercise. So in this slide, I try to give you the overall picture. And in the next slides, I will start from the output report and walk you back through how we get there. So how we get to this report. So here we are showing, let's say, a first draft, an example of how a standardized reporting format would look like. So we're showing this for illustration. It's hypothetical. It's an hypothetical example only for illustration. So we have medicine A, medicine B, and medicine C. And the idea here is just to show that we would like to have a single harmonized view for each critical medicine in the union list. We want to have one view, one report that summarizes not only the numerical results and the indicators, but also the context behind them, the details behind them. So this format, I will not spend time on the details because it's an hypothetical example and it's just for illustration, but this format ensures that all critical medicines are evaluated and reported in a comparable and harmonized way. This is very important, and we want to use the same structure, we want to use the same terminology when we provide information on the vulnerabilities in the supply chains of the critical medicines. Now, let me explain the key principles of the methodology. And before going into the details, I would like to clarify one important point. So I would like to stress that structural and conditional vulnerabilities are not mutually exclusive. So a critical medicine can have both vulnerabilities at the same time. So we are not putting critical medicines into one category or the other. We are looking at different types of risks together, all together. So we're looking at both types of risk, both types of vulnerabilities together. I will follow the same backward logic here, starting from the vulnerabilities themselves. First, conditional vulnerabilities. So these, the conditional vulnerabilities, as I said, they are vulnerabilities that appear under certain conditions. So for example, during disruptions, during a demand increase, and to understand them, we need more, I would say, contextual information. You know, we need context. So typical examples of this type of information include, for example, how safety stocks are managed, whether there have been historical shortages related to supply chains and to manufacturing, quality issues, historical data on quality issues, or specific production constraints. For example, if a medicinal product, if a critical medicine has a complex technology. To capture this, to capture these aspects, we rely mainly on qualitative or semi-quantitative data. And in particular, we will rely on data from shortage prevention plans, as well as from information, of course, provided directly by you from your own assessments and risk management strategies. Now, moving to the structural vulnerabilities, which is about the structure of the supply chains. Here we are looking at the underlying structure of the supply chain, how it is organized in the long term, what is, I would say, the topology of the supply chain network. And these are captured through a set of indicators, which I will explain in detail in the next slide. So here we have quantitative indicators, external dependency, so dependency outside from the EEA, supply diversity, market concentration, and marketing authorization holders diversity. Now, to calculate these indicators, we rely on quantitative data. So we rely on data, for example, where manufacturing sites are located. We need to know where sites are located. We need to know production and how production is distributed geographically. Because if you want to have dependencies, you need to know where production is. We need to know how concentrated suppliers are. And of course, an important data element here is how supply is shared across different actors and supply chain steps. So we need to know the supply shares between the economic actors across the supply chain steps. So overall, the methodology combines two types of information: more contextual, more qualitative insights for conditional vulnerabilities, and then, on the other hand, more structured, more quantitative data for identifying structural vulnerabilities. And this combination of structured data and contextual insights is what allows us to build a complete picture of the risks in the supply chains of the critical medicines. And here in this slide is the set of indicators that we will use for measuring the structural vulnerabilities. So these are the key indicators for quantifying structural vulnerabilities, for measuring structural vulnerabilities. And we actually work with two main sets of indicators. One set focuses on the manufacturing side of the supply chain, and we apply it to each key step, to each supply chain tier. So we will have these indicators calculated for each supply chain tier. And the second set looks at the marketing authorization holders. So we are looking at how the medicine is supplied and marketed across the EU. Now, the first indicator, so the external EU EEA dependency, is an indicator that looks at how much of a critical medicines production happens outside the EU. So in simple terms, it tells us how dependent we are on manufacturing steps that take place outside of Europe. And the larger that share, of course, the more exposed we are to disruptions that are beyond the EU control. So, for example, if the active substance and the final manufacturing steps take place mainly outside of the EU, then this indicator will be high, meaning that we rely heavily on production outside Europe. The second indicator is the supply diversity of manufacturing sites. And this indicator looks at how diversified the manufacturing network is. So we consider two things here. First, we consider redundancy, so how many different manufacturing sites are involved. And second, we consider geographical spread, so whether those sites are concentrated in one country or spread across several countries. Now, if a critical medicine relies heavily on just one site or one country, then we all understand that a single disruption, such as a factory issue or a local crisis like a natural disaster or an army conflict, can interrupt the entire supply of this critical medicine. Now, the more sites and the more geographically spread they are, then the more resilient the supply chain tends to be. The third indicator is an indicator for marketing linked to marketing authorization holders, and it is the standard market concentration indicator. And this indicator measures how commercially concentrated a product supply is, so how dominant one or a few marketing authorization holders are in the market. So a high concentration means that the market is relying a lot on a very few players, is very reliant on a very few players. So there is a high risk of supply disruptions if those players fail. So if there is a failure, if something happens to those players, then we have a high risk of supply disruption. And the last indicator is the marketing authorization holder diversity. Now, this indicator looks at the diversity of marketing authorization holders. It helps us identify medicines, critical medicines that may be vulnerable, not because of manufacturing problems, but because there are too few companies authorized to market these critical medicines. So the diversity indicator, I would say, that complements the market concentration indicator, because market concentration tells us how dominant one company may be, but this indicator, the diversity indicator, focuses on whether there are enough different marketing authorization holders present. If, as an example, just to give an example, only 2 marketing authorization holders are active for a critical medicine, then supply can be vulnerable even if no single company dominates the market. So even if these 2 marketing authorization holders have 50% market share, it's only 2 marketing authorizations, so we still have vulnerability in the supply chain. And let me conclude. I will conclude this part of the presentation by coming to the starting point of what we discussed. So coming back to the data. So we began with the legal requirements under the new pharmaceutical legislation and the Critical Medicines Act. We then discussed how the methodology works, what kind of outputs we want to produce, and what types of vulnerabilities we are trying to identify with this methodology. But to make all of this work in practice, in order to have the application of the methodology, we need data. And this is a key point. This data, I would say, they are not available from any external provider. There's no commercial data set. There's no central source that can give us a full and reliable picture of supply chains, a picture of risks and mitigation measures. So the only way to build this understanding and to meet the legal requirements is through the information held by you, is the information that you have, the information that the marketing authorization holders have. So as it was already highlighted before, your role here is absolutely essential. What we are asking for is data covering the two main aspects we discussed already. So we are asking data on contextual information, so to understand conditional vulnerabilities. And on the other hand, we are asking data, quantitative data, more structured data to evaluate structural vulnerabilities. I should also acknowledge, I should say here that this is not a small exercise. The template we have prepared is quite detailed with several sections and variables. You see the sections here, and we'll present them in the next section of the workshop. But it has been designed, I have to say that it has been designed to reflect exactly the two dimensions we have just discussed and to allow us to build a complete and robust picture of supply chain vulnerabilities. So this brings me to the next, I would say, part of my presentation in the second section of the workshop. So after my colleague Peter Jan will present the critical INNs in scope for this year, I will walk you through the data template. I will walk you in detail in the data elements, and I will explain what is expected and how you can fill in the template in practice. And I stop here for now. And yeah, thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions also on the methodology. Back to the chair, back to you, Charles. Thank you.
Thank you, Thanos, for this detailed presentation, and good to know that the methodology is published on the EMA website, so participants will be able to review it later.
So I propose that now we'll move to the next technical session. And for the next technical presentation, I will give the floor to my colleague Peter Jan this year. He's going to describe the rationale for accelerating the vulnerability assessment in advance of the legislation, but also the criteria that was used to prioritize these 19 INNs that are in scope of this exercise, and also the timelines for this year. This will also set the scene for what is expected from you as marketing authorization holders during this exercise. Please do keep sending your questions via Slido, and we will pause later in this session to go through as many questions as possible. So, Peter Jan, please go ahead.
So good morning from my side as well. So I'll now go a bit more detail in what we're going to carry out in 2026. As my colleague Thanos presented before, that was the overall overview of the general vulnerability assessment, and I will talk a bit about what we're actually going to do in 2026. So as stated before, we need to the context of this the vulnerability assessment of the first set of INNs is the fact that the new pharma legislation will be introduced earlier than we initially anticipated, and that also includes the implementation of the vulnerability assessment. That's why we already decided to focus on a first set of INNs that will be able to for the CMA Act provisions and also the MSSG recommendations. So the template which my colleague will present shortly is actually based on the obligations to supply data in the new pharmaceutical legislation, including the provisions in the shortage prevention plans, but adopted to inform the vulnerability assessment of the supply chain. So it's not a one-on-one, but we adopted it in a way, in a template that is practical for use when requesting the information as well. So the EMA will also not carry out the assessment on its own. Each of the INNs will be assigned to one of the member states for assessment, but EMA will of course be helping out and will be providing support. So the vulnerability assessment is an action that we're taking out on a broader EU level with both EMA and of course each of our member states. The outcomes will be shared with MSSG. As stated before, we are carrying out the analysis on a medicinal product level, but of course, where applicable, we'll also aggregate the results in order to inform the full decision making. And of course, feedback will be provided to each of you, to the participating marketing authorization holders, to also help you out. So how was the first set of INN selected? Well, as shown my colleague as my colleague before, the starting point is the union list of critical medicines. Because it's impossible to carry out the entire analysis at once, a first set was decided using a base of pragmatic criteria. So what we carried out is that we looked at INNs which had medicines that had been subject to critical shortages since 2023. So that was the first selection criteria. Then we also looked at medicines for which we have already identified which there are known vulnerabilities, including dependencies that came out of the shortage management of EMA. And we also consulted our member states, and we also included medicines for which they have already identified vulnerabilities. So these criteria were used for the first set of INNs in order to create a pragmatic set that according to the criteria selected, will be able to provide some MSSG recommendations and even inform the Critical Medicines Act. As stated before multiple times, the market authorization holders are a very important partner. And in order to be able to carry out the assessments, we need input from the marketing authorization holders, because EMA and even our member states do not have all the relevant information readily available. For EMA, it's especially on nationally authorized products. My colleague said approximately 95% of the union list of critical medicines are nationally authorized products. EMA does not have a full data available for the nationally authorized products. So, and this is all information that only the marketing authorization holders you can provide to us. So that's why the template was created. Each of you will be provided with an Excel template, which will then be able to be submitted through UDrawLink. And as stated before, the template was set up in line with the obligations set out in the NPL and the CMA Act. A note on data protection and the security of confidential and commercially sensitive information. We are well aware that the information that is being requested is commercially sensitive and needs to be protected. All data will be treated in accordance with the applicable EU data protection legislation and the agency's established rules on confidential information. So those of you who have worked with EMA before, have provided information to us before, know that we do everything we can to prevent unjust disclosure, and no information will be carried out, and we're handling all commercially sensitive information as securely as possible. So next on the INNs itself. So these are the INNs in scope of the first set of the vulnerability assessment. The assessment will be carried out at INN pharma form level. For sake of clarity, we looked at ATC code level 5 and the applicable pharma form. So you will see that some of the pharma forms are majority parental forms according to the route of administration included in the union list of critical medicines for the INN. So for instance, you will see that for clarithromycin, the pharma forms are only the parenteral forms, the solution for infusion, solution for injections. But for azithromycin, you will see that the scope of medicines is that scope of products is much broader. It's not just the parenteral forms, it's also each of the oral forms, such as the coated tablet, the capsules, and the oral suspensions. We've chosen this way in order to go and at a more granular level to fully understand the supply chains, and of course we'll propagate up where possible. So for which products we are only looking at the intravenous forms. So that is for hydroxycobalamin, erythromycin, clarithromycin, human anti-D, ifosfamide, peginterferon alpha 2A, olanzapine, fluoroacil, vinblastine, Christine, cisplatin, epinephrine, and oxaliplatin. So for that, the assessment will only include the parenteral forms. For the others, for azithromycin, methotrexate, etoposide, cyclophosphamide, fludarabine, and valproic acid, the assessment will include both the parenteral forms and the oral forms as set out by the Union List of Critical Medicines. So that is why for some medicines, for some of the medicines you might have, from some of the INNs, you might have more medicinal products authorized in the EU, but we restricted the set to only those that are relevant for the route of administration included in the Union List of Critical Medicine. And finally, on the timeline for 2026, these are our envisioned steps. So we aim to have the full assessment ready and be able to present to MSSG by the end of this year, by December 16th. So today we are the 18th of March. Today we have the workshop, which is the important first step in the participation of the market authorization holders. Next week you will receive a template that is pre-populated for each of the marketing authorization holders with information that we currently have available in EMA's SPOR system. So the template will contain information on all medicinal products with a valid authorization in the EU EEA. There is a possibility of data gaps. We are well aware of that when the PMS products were ported over from XEV-MPD and from Siamet. However, if MAHs, if any of you identify any issues, any missing data or actual mistakes, EMA invites you to update the information through the PMS UI, because that is very important, because all of us know that we can only produce solid outcomes if we work on a solid foundation of accurate data. So there might be, if you receive the template, there might be data gaps. So that is why we're asking you also, where applicable, to also update PMS so that we have the full data set available. You will receive these templates next week. So the deadline for returning them to us is tight. We are well aware of that, but we are asking you to provide them to us, all the the filled-in template, by the 30th of April, because then we, EMA, and of course our member states will start with the assessment of each of the INNs, which we also assume will take a lot of time. The rapporteurs have a deadline to finalize each of the assessments by the 18th of September, so that there is still sufficient time to look at all of the reports and have a full report available, ready to be presented at MSSG by the 16th of December. So this is our current deadline, and this is our current timeline. And I will now give the floor back to my colleague Thanos.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter Jan. So now that we have covered the methodology for the vulnerability assessment, we've covered the legal basis and the INNs that are prioritized for the assessment this year. We'll move now to the data that is needed to carry out the vulnerability assessment in more detail. Now, I want to remind you that we have this workshop today. We will publish the recording from the workshop in the EMA's website, and we also share supporting materials with you to help you complete the template. We will also work with the member states to support them through this process. So now I hand over back to Thanos, and he's going to take us step by step through the data that will be requested to you to be submitted by the 30th of April to allow us to meet this expected timeline of the end of the year and also to help you already prepare for implementation of the legislation. So Thanos, please go ahead.
Thank you, Monica. So maybe before walking you through the template, briefly explain the thinking behind how we designed the template. So our main objective was to have the right balance between robustness of the methodology and proportionality in the data request. So in other words, we want to collect the information that is necessary to apply the vulnerability assessment in a meaningful, let's say, and robust way, while at the same time, we would like to avoid, we tried, let's say, to avoid unnecessary burden for you, unnecessary burden for the marketing authorization holders. Now, to achieve this, of course, we went to the methodology, we carefully reviewed the methodology, and we asked ourselves for each indicator and each analytical step, what is the minimum set of data that we truly need in order to apply it properly? So to have the minimum data requirements. So the template is built in a way that each data variable has a direct link to a specific element of the methodology. Now, at the same time, we tried as much as possible to avoid asking for commercially sensitive or very granular, I would say, data. Sometimes we cannot avoid it. And where possible, we used structured questions or aggregated, I would say, indicators instead of asking detailed operational information. So the intention here, the intention in the template, in the design of the template, was really to provide a clear, structured, and proportionate template that allows us to apply the methodology in a robust way while keeping this effort for companies as manageable as possible. So with that in mind, let me now walk you through the structure of the template. We try to organize it in a way that is clear and easy to navigate so that you can understand not only what information is requested, but also why it is requested and how it will be used. And the template starts with a few guidance sheets and then moves into the 6 data sections where the actual information will be provided. I will share my screen. Okay, so the first sheet is the cover sheet. As you can see, we have the first sheet, the cover sheet. Okay, so the first sheet is the cover sheet, and you will see here it's just a cover. You will see the name of your company, but it will be pre-populated, so you don't need to do anything in this sheet. The second sheet is the README sheet. And in this sheet, we provide practical guidance on how to complete the template. So we include general instructions for filling the different sections. I think it's very important first to go through this README sheet before going to fill the 1 to 6 sheets with data. And then the third Excel sheet in this template is the data dictionary, which defines each variable that is included in the template. And the idea here is to ensure that all companies or marketing authorization holders interpret the questions in the same way. The terminology, we explain the terminology, we give the definitions, and so to be sure that all companies or marketing authorization holders understand exactly what information is expected. Now, after these 3 introductory, let's say, sheets, we then have the 6 sections where the actual data will be reported, which are linked to the main components of the vulnerability assessment methodology. So the first here, so the first sheet is the market and product sheet, and The first variables here is, so we have the active substance. The first variable is the active substance. So we give, we ask you for the active substance. The next field is the ATC code, which corresponds to the standard ATC classification. Then we have the product name, which would be the commercial name under which the product is marketed. Next, we ask for the marketing authorization holder's name. The following field is the marketing authorization holder address, which is simply the registered address of the marketing authorization holder. Then we have the PMS ID, which refers to the product identifier used in the product management system, which allows us to link the information consistently across our systems. The marketing authorization number corresponds to the marketing authorization number assigned to the product. We also ask, we don't ask, I will tell you, I mean, all these fields will be pre-populated. So we have here also the procedure type. The next variable is the pharmaceutical form, which describes the dosage form of the product, for example, film-coated tablet, capsule, solution for injection, and so on. Then in column J, we capture the strength, and in column K, the route of administration. And in column L, we ask for the marketed country, which simply captures the country where the product is currently marketed. One important point here to mention is that these first columns, so the core product information, will be pre-populated. So in this case, we would simply ask you, so you will receive the template, and all these fields will be pre-populated. So we would simply ask you to review and validate the information, and then indicate, you should do that. You should indicate the countries where the product is marketed using separate rows for each country. So when you have a product, you will need to give the country, and please use separate rows for each country. Now, for sections 2, 3, and 4, where we move to the mapping of the supply chain, the approach is a bit different, but I will explain it also later when I'm showing these sheets. So in these sections, in the first columns of each section, we ask you to include only the products and the corresponding product information where the supply chain differs. So in other words, the level of detail in this column should reflect, let's say, distinct supply chains. So if a product has the same supply chain across markets, it only needs to be reported once. So if there are differences, for example, different manufacturing sites or supply flows, then these should be reported separately. Now, in columns, let's move to the next, or maybe let's move to columns M and N. So we ask here in columns M and N, we ask two variables that give us information related to market demand expressed in units of presentation, following the ISO IDMP definition. What we ask here is simply the total number of units of presentation sold in the last 12 months based on your internal accounting or sales data. So for example, if we take our hypothetical products here, for the first product for amoxicillin capsules, the unit of presentation would be capsule, and the company might report something like 48 million capsules sold in the last 12 months. For the insulin injection, so for the second hypothetical product here, the unit of presentation could be vial. So the example here is you can provide 9.5 million vials sold. And for an inhalation product like salbutamol, the unit of presentation would be actuation, reflecting the number of inhaler doses delivered. So essentially, we are asking for a simple demand indicator expressed in the presentation unit of the product. And just one small clarification here, because this is something that sometimes creates confusion. When we refer to unit of presentation, we do not mean the pack. For instance, if a pack contains 20 capsules, we would not report the number of packs sold, but rather the total number of capsules contained in those packs. So if a company sold 1 million packs of amoxicillin with 20 capsules per pack, then the value reported here would be 20 million capsules. Now, moving to the columns O to W, this, let's say, group of variables relates to specific product and manufacturing characteristics. So the objective here is to identify certain technologies or formulation characteristics that may influence manufacturing complexity or supply chain resilience. For each of these variables, the answer is simple. It's just yes or no. So the variable, for example, in column O is whether the finished product is lyophilized, so meaning that the product has been freeze-dried during the manufacturing process, which is often used to improve stability. The variable in column P asks whether the product is radiopharmaceutical, which typically involves specialized production and distribution requirements. Then column Q captures whether the product is manufactured using fermentation. The variable in column R asks whether the product is a biological medicinal product. Column S captures metered dose inhalation products or inhalation powders. The variable in column T asks whether the product is an ophthalmic preparation, such as eye drops or ophthalmic solutions. As I said, all the answers here, you have a drop-down menu which says yes or no. The variable in column U asks whether the API concentration is very low, meaning that the active ingredient represents less than 2% of the total composition of the finished product. And this type of formulation can sometimes introduce additional manufacturing or quality control challenges, which is why we capture it here. And the purpose of these flags is simply to capture product characteristics that may affect manufacturing complexity or supply chain dependencies, which helps us interpret the vulnerability analysis later on. Now, the next two variables in columns V and W relate to drug-device combination products, and in particular, integral drug-device combinations. Now, the first question asks whether the medicinal product is an integral drug-device combination product, and this refers to products where the drug and the device make a single integrated product, meaning that the device is necessary for the administration of the medicine and cannot be separated from it. And examples here include pre-filled pens, for example, for insulins, auto-injectors or inhalers, where the device and the medicinal product are supplied together as a single integrated product. Now, if the answer to this question is yes, then we ask a follow-up question whether the product incorporates new technology or new software within the device component. The reason that we capture this information is that devices incorporating advanced technologies or software may introduce additional manufacturing or supply chain dependencies, which are relevant when analyzing supply chain vulnerabilities. The next set of variables focuses on device combinations and specific production requirements, which may influence manufacturing flexibility and supply resilience. First, in column X, we ask whether the medicinal product is a co-packed drug-device combination product. So this refers to cases where the medicinal product and the medical device are placed together in the same pack. And if the answer is yes, we then ask a follow-up question in column Y, whether the medicinal product can be used with different devices for administration. And the objective here is to understand whether there is flexibility in the choice of device or whether the product depends on a very specific device configuration. Then the variable in column Z relates to specific production requirements. Here we ask whether the finished product requires particular conditions during manufacturing or during distribution. So, for example, sterility, cold storage, freezing conditions, handling of toxic substances, or specific transport requirements. So, if there are additional requirements not covered by the predefined options in column Z, then in column AA, there is also the possibility to specify them in an open text field. So here I would like to make also an important note that given that in column Z, it is not possible to make multiple choices. We cannot have this. I mean, we are bounded by Excel. We cannot make multiple choices in the cell. please use column AA to complement with additional answers, with additional options, the choice that you made in column Z. So for example, here you see that in the second row, we have answered sterility in column Z, but then we have also added cold storage in column AA because this product has both requirements. And the same in the third row, we have chosen the toxicity option from the drop-down menu of column Z, and then we added the text transport in column AA. Now, column AB captures whether complex technology is used in the manufacturing process that could create challenges for transferring production to another site or for scaling up production. The purpose of this question is to identify cases where the manufacturing technology itself may limit operational flexibility. In the next column, in column AC, we ask for an overall assessment of how these specific production requirements affect manufacturing flexibility and supply continuity. And the response options here range from products with standard production requirements to products with more specialized requirements that may constrain flexibility under stress conditions. And finally, to products with highly specialized production processes that could significantly affect supply continuity. Now, if the answer indicates that constraints exist, then in column AD, we also invite you to briefly specify the nature of these constraints. The last variable in column AE of this sheet captures seasonality in demand, meaning whether demand for the product shows significant fluctuations during the year. So what we ask here is essentially how peak demand compares to the average level of demand during a typical year. The first answer option corresponds to products where demand is relatively stable throughout the year, with peak demand being less than 20% higher than the average monthly demand. The second drop-down option captures cases where demand shows moderate seasonal variation, meaning that peak demand may be between 20 and 50% higher than the average monthly demand. And then the third option refers to products with strong seasonal demand patterns, where peak demand is more than 50% higher than the average monthly demand. So the objective of this variable is simply to capture whether seasonal demand patterns may place additional pressure on the supply chain during certain periods of the year. Now, moving to section 2 of the template. So after identifying the product and its key characteristics in the first section, we now move to the second section, which focuses on the manufacturing operators, on the manufacturing actors involved in the supply chain. The objective of this section, the objective of this sheet, is to identify the different manufacturing sites involved in producing the medicinal product and to understand their role in the supply chain. So here we're already going into the mapping of the supply chain. So as I explained before, in the first columns of this section, in columns A to D, we ask you to include only the products and the corresponding product information where the supply chain differs. So in first section, you will have like a huge list because you have also the different countries where it is marketing. Here, we want you to take the information from sheet 1, but to include here only the products where the supply chain differs. So this column should include, as I said before, the information of your products with distinct supply chains. So if a product has the same supply chain across markets, it only needs to be reported once. You don't need to do it again and again. If there are differences, if we have different manufacturing sites, different supply flows, then these should be reported, as I said before, separately. Now, going to columns E to N, we could see we can see that the variables in columns F to I simply capture the basic identification of each manufacturing site. So we start with the site name in column F, and maybe to make an important note here that please use different rows. I mean, it's Excel. It's not the best way to collect data, but we have to use this format for confidentiality in order to handle your data in the best way in terms of confidentiality. So please use different rows for each site and don't put multiple site names in the same Excel cell, in the same row. Add each site in a separate row, in separate rows, and for each new site listed, please repeat the product information from columns A to D on that row, or leave the columns A to D empty and just use the first row and just repeat the sites. We then ask for the site address in column G, meaning the full address of the site, including the city. Please include the city. The next variable in column H is the site country, which indicates the country where the site is located. In column I, we request the OMS location ID, which is the unique identifier used in the organization management system to identify the physical location. And then in column J, we ask whether the site is a contract manufacturing organization, and you reply with yes or no. The next variable in column K captures the role of the site in the manufacturing process. So here we are asking you to indicate whether the site is involved in API manufacturing, in processing operations for the medicinal product, or another role in the supply chain that you need to indicate. If the role is different from the predefined options, then there is the possibility in column L to specify the role of the site in an open text field. In column M, we capture whether the site is located inside or outside the EU, outside the European area. In column N, we ask about the operational status of the site for the specific medicinal product. So here we are asking you to indicate whether the site is currently active or if it is inactive but could be activated, and if so, how quickly this could happen. The response options in this column range from sites that are fully active to sites that could be activated quickly, sites that require some preparation time, and sites that would require significant effort or time before becoming operational. Now, this information helps us understand whether additional manufacturing capacity could potentially be mobilized, I would say, if needed. Now, in columns, go to columns. O to U. So after identifying the manufacturing sites and their roles, this group of variables focuses on the characteristics of the manufacturing process and the production capacity of each site. So the columns O and P capture the structure of the manufacturing process at the site. In column O, we ask for the total number of manufacturing steps required to produce the medicinal product at that site. And this gives us an indication of how long or complex the production process may be. In column P, we ask for the number of distinct production lines dedicated to this product at the site. This helps us understand whether production is concentrated in a single line or whether there is some degree of redundancy within the site. The variable in column Q asks for the maximum manufacturing step length, meaning the number of days required for the longest individual step in the production process. And this is a variable that helps us identify cases where a single step may represent a bottleneck or where long processes duration could limit responsiveness to demand changes, to demand spikes. Column R asks for the process capability index, which is a commonly used indicator in manufacturing to measure how consistently a process performs within its specification limits. There is also the definition in the data dictionary. And here in the drop-down menu of column R, the drop-down menu of answers, we simply ask you to indicate whether the CPK, whether the indicator is greater than or equal to 1 or lower than 1. And this provides a high-level indication of process robustness and stability without requiring, let's say, detailed operational data. In column S, we ask for an overall assessment of the production process complexity at the site. So the objective here is to capture qualitatively whether the manufacturing process is relatively standardized, whether it involves some level of complexity, or is highly specialized, so more sensitive to disruptions. And in columns T and U, we collect information on maximum annual production capacity for the product at the site. And in column T, we ask you to report the maximum annual output that the site could produce for this medicinal product. And then In column U asks for a high-level assessment of how this capacity compares with average demand to understand whether the site has significant headroom, limited headroom, or very little flexibility to respond to demand increases or disruptions. The next set of variables, this is a long sheet, I would say. So the next set of variables focuses on production utilization and the ability of the site to increase output if needed. So these elements here are important because they help us understand whether the manufacturing system has sufficient flexibility to respond to demand increases or supply disruptions. First, we ask about current manufacturing capacity utilization. In column V, we ask you to report the average capacity utilization for this medicinal product at the specific site over the last 24 months. We ask you to express this as a percentage of a maximum production capacity. Column W asks for the maximum monthly utilization reached during the last 2 years, which gives us an indication of how close the site has already operated to its capacity limits. And in addition to the numeric values, we ask in column X, we include a simplified categorical assessment that describes whether the average utilization is below 70%, between 70% and 90%, or above 90% of maximum capacity. The objective here is simply to understand whether the site has significant available headroom, limited headroom, or very little spare capacity. Now, columns Y to AB focus on the ability of the site to increase production in the short to medium term. In column Y, we ask you to estimate the maximum additional production that could be achieved within 8 weeks, expressed as a percentage increase over the baseline output. Columns Z and AA ask for the time required to increase production by 20% and by 50%, which helps us understand how quickly production could be scaled up if needed. And in column AB, we include a summary, again, a categorical assessment describing whether production could be increased by more than 30%, between 10 and 30%, or less than 10% above baseline output. And this provides a high-level indication of how flexible the manufacturing site is in responding to changes in demand or supply disruptions. Now, this set of variables in columns AC to AG. So in column AC, we ask about the average production lead time at the site. In column AD, we ask again about the average production lead time, but here we include a simplified classification describing whether the lead time is short, moderate, or long. So you have a drop-down menu of short, moderate, or long. In columns AE and AF, we ask the lead time required to restart supply after a significant disruption. So in other words, if production were interrupted due to an operational issue, how long would it typically take for the site to restart production and restore supply? Column AE includes a categorical assessment describing whether the restart lead time is short, moderate, or long. And in column F, we ask you to report the longest restart duration experienced during the past 36 months, so the past 3 years, which helps us provide a reference point for how long recovery may take in practice for each site. In column AG, we ask you to briefly describe the main production, so it's an open text. We want you to briefly describe the main production bottlenecks at the site. And this, as I said, is an open text field where you can identify specific constraints in the production process. And the last columns, the last variables in this section focus on logistics-related aspects of the manufacturing site. So column 8AH asks whether the output of the site requires temperature control logistics. In column AI, you are asked to indicate to what extent cold chain requirements may affect supply continuity. So here we have a drop-down options that range from cases where temperature control logistics have little impact to high impact. And the last column, AJ, in this section looks more broadly at logistical bottlenecks affecting the supply of the products from the sites. And here you are asked to indicate whether logistics operations are generally flexible, whether there are some bottlenecks that could affect supply under stress conditions, or whether logistical constraints significantly limit the ability to supply the product. Overall, the information that we will receive in this section, in this sheet, allows us, as I said before, to map the manufacturing network, the manufacturing supply chain network, to understand the operational characteristics of each site, and to identify potential production or logistical constraints that could affect supply continuity. And now that we have the information to identify the manufacturing sites and their characteristics, the next section, section 3, focuses on how these sites are connected within the supply chain, meaning the flows of materials between them. So this is section 3. We call it manufacturing supply flows. So here we would like to capture the flows of materials between the different manufacturing sites, which allow us to reconstruct the supply chain network for the medicinal product. And as I explained before, in the first columns of this first section, we ask you to include only the products, only the corresponding product information where the supply chain differs. Yes. So columns E to M, which is all the data that we are asking here. In columns F and G, you are asked to indicate the origin and destination of each manufacturing flow. So we have the from site, column F. So column F is from site, refers to the site where a material or intermediate product is produced. And then we have column G, which is called to site, refers to the site where that material is sent for the next step of manufacturing. So from site to site. Again, here, please use a separate row for each flow. So for each origin and destination couple of sites, please use a different row. And for every supply flow, please repeat the product information from columns A to D on that row, or leave it empty, at least. But we need to know to which product it refers, so this flow of material from site to site, we need to indicate to which product we're talking about. So it is important here to know that each row represents one material flow between two manufacturing sites. So in other words, for each tier, for each step of the supply chain, we ask you to indicate where the material comes from and where it goes next. So for example, let's assume the following, I have already the following simplified supply chain for the first hypothetical product of this example. So site A, let's assume that site A produces the API. Then the API is sent to site B, where the finished product is manufactured. The finished product is then sent to site C, where packaging takes place. So as you can see, this is the way to put it in the Excel sheet. And here the assumption is, and this is important, the assumption here is that all API production in site A goes to site B. And all the production of finished product in site B goes to site C. And that's why you have there the 100% flow. Now, in the second hypothetical product here, site D produces API that is applied to two finished product sites. So site D supplies API to site E and to site F. Site E receives the 70% of the API produced by site D, and site F receives the rest 30% of the API produced by site D. So to avoid confusion, I have to mention here that the flow share refers to the share of production flowing between the two sites and not to the share of the market. So we're not talking about the market share, but we're talking about the flow share, the share of production that flows between the two sites. And I would like also to clarify that we are not asking for commercially sensitive transaction data, but simply, we were careful here to ask for an approximate share of production flows between the sites involved in the manufacturing process, and not to ask for for specific data. Now, why we're asking for flow? The flow shares allow us to distinguish between diversified supply chains and highly concentrated ones, which is critical for our methodology and for evaluating vulnerabilities. So this variable flow share in column J is very important for identifying structural vulnerabilities in the supply chain. And then in column H, we ask for the material name, meaning the product of intermediate that is being transferred between the sites. So for example, the name of the API or the name of the intermediate substance or the final product that is sent for packaging. The material type in column I simply categorizes the type of material involved in the flow. So for example, API, intermediate product, or finished product. This helps us understand which stage, which tier of the supply chain the flow corresponds to. We then ask for the flow share in column J, as I said, which represents the percentage of total production of the origin site, which we have in column F, that flows to the destination site that we have in column G. This is very important variable because it allows us to understand how dependent the supply chain is on specific links between sites. So for example, if 100% of the API produced at one site flows to a single downstream site, then that most probably represents a potential concentration risk. Next, in column K, we ask for the average lead time for the transfer of the material between the two sites. In column L, we also ask for the transport mode used for the flow. And finally, in column M, we ask you to indicate the transport sensitivity of the flow, meaning how vulnerable the material transfer may be to transport disruptions. For example, certain flows may depend on specialized logistics conditions. So overall, I would say that this section allows us to reconstruct the manufacturing supply chain network and identify potential dependencies or critical links between the sites. Now, moving to section 4. So section 4 is the critical key inputs. Here we would like to identify key materials or specialized equipment that are essential for manufacturing process. Here we have first variable asking to identify the critical key input material or critical single-use equipment used in the manufacturing process. Here I have to say that we don't ask you to include the active substance or intermediate products. I mean, we already captured this. Here we're asking for critical materials or specialized equipment required for the production. For example, specialized filters, needles, or other materials that are essential for the manufacturing process. And all the questions here are related to, so column G asks for the name of the supplier of the critical input. Column H asks for the country where the supplier is located. Column I asks for the supplier share, meaning the percentage of the total supply of that input provided by the given supplier. So for example, imagine that for the production of the first hypothetical product here, a critical input is a sterile, as I put it there, a sterile filter. So the company is taking this filter from two suppliers. Supplier A is in Germany and provides the 70% of the filters used in the production, and supplier B is in China and provides the 30% of the filters for this product. In column J, we ask for the supplier lead time. In column K, we ask for the stock cover. In column L, we ask about substitutability, meaning whether the input could reasonably be replaced by another material or supplier without major changes, or another supplier. And this section allows us to identify critical upstream dependencies. Now, going to more, let's say, conditional vulnerabilities, section 5 focuses on stock management and inventory buffers, so safety stocks, which are important, let's say, mechanisms for absorbing supply disruptions. So in this section, we capture several elements related to how safety stocks are managed for the medicinal product. First, we look at whether a formal stock policy exists and what factors determine the level of safety stock that is maintained. We also capture how stock levels are monitored. Another important aspect here is the adequacy of safety stocks under stress. We therefore ask companies, we ask you to indicate the maximum supply disruption or demand spike that could be absorbed without causing a shortage. We also look at the ability to increase stock levels proactively. And finally, we capture information on the geographical distribution of stocks, how quickly stocks can be rebuilt after depletion, and whether commercial constraints may affect stock holding decisions. I go fast with these sections because, most questions are questions that they have drop-down menus with predetermined answers. And then we have conditional vulnerabilities. The last section is on conditional vulnerabilities. And here, the factors, we have here the factors that may not necessarily be visible in the structural supply chain itself, but can influence how resilient supply is under certain conditions. So the first part of the section captures operational experience over the past 3 years. So we include here quality defects, batch recalls, shortages linked to manufacturing or supply chain issues. And we also collect information on organizational processes. So we collect information on whether companies have structured mechanisms for notifying authorities of disruptions and detecting early signals of supply issues in the distribution chain. And this section also looks at demand dynamics, including demand volatility and the ability to anticipate demand changes. And in addition, we capture factors related to supply flexibility. So we ask questions about the ability to increase production in the short term, constraints that may limit scale up, and whether supply can be reallocated across markets during periods of stress, during periods of demand spikes. Finally, we also consider market and strategic factors such as dependence on tenders. We ask for price pressure, more qualitative questions, of course. We don't ask for prices. We ask for potential market prioritization, and we also ask for the likelihood of discontinuation, of whether the probability of having a product being discontinued in the future. So together, these variables help us understand how the supply chain behaves under stress and which contextual factors may increase the risk of supply disruptions. And I think with this last sheet, I stop here. I hope that everything was clear. And of course, we will be here to support you in all the process of filling this questionnaire, this template. Back to you, Monica.
Thank you so much, Thanos, and thank you for this very detailed explanation on all the data fields that are included in a template that has been sent to you ahead of this workshop. So I hope you had it handy to go through it. So I would like to now just go through the next steps. Please, the next slide, if you could. So just some closing remarks. The vulnerability assessment for the first 19 INNs will have the outcome will be tangible, as it will inform policy measures both under the new pharma legislation, but also the proposed Critical Medicines Act. And just to confirm to you that the data requests that we are putting forward to you, they are aligned with new obligations under both regulations. Now, the commitment from MAH is key, as we've discussed throughout the workshop for the assessment. So on the week commencing 23rd of March, you will receive the Excel template that Thanos presented in detail with the pre-filled cells. So some of the information that is available to us will already be included in the Excel, in particular, medicinal product specific information. Now, we will ask you to fill in the templates with the information and send it back to EMA and the rapporteurs by 30th of April. We see your plea to extend further this deadline, and as my colleague Vanessa mentioned, we will discuss the possibility during the next meeting of the MSHE. Now, I think I want to stress again before we close that the data will be treated in accordance with applicable EU data protection legislation, including Regulation 2018-1725, And also the agencies established rules on confidential and commercial sensitive information with no unjustified disclosure. And I think we have quite a long experience in this regard. We will, EMA and the MSSG, keep you, MAHs and industry representative associations informed throughout the process and also upon completion of this exercise. So we, as I mentioned earlier on, we want to close the loop. So we'll ask you for information, but we'll also provide you then will provide you support throughout the process. But once the exercise is finalized, we will give you feedback because that is very important and you see how the data is used. Now you raised some questions, and there are some concerns in relation to the scope of this work, and we're taking this on board. But I think also from the questions we receive, we see that is a willingness to work together and to share this data that is necessary for this shared objective. So I think there is certainly a clear commitment to support the identification of vulnerabilities in the supply chain of critical medicines. And this will then be used to inform measures to strengthen and secure supply of critical medicines for you patients and healthcare systems, as I mentioned before. So thank you very much once again for your time today. And I will now pass the floor to Charles also for some concluding remarks from his side. Thank you.
Indeed, I will now close this workshop with my special thanks to Vanessa, Peter, Jan, and Thanos, and to you all for your attendance and engagement. We look forward to your continued collaboration on this important work, and we reiterate that we are available to support and give you feedback throughout the process. We understand that it is challenging, but we needed to shift from a reactive to a proactive approach of shortages. Finally, as previously said, any questions that have not been addressed will be included in the Q&A document that will be made available to you shortly. So thank you and have a nice day. I hope you all have sun like we have to do today in Belgium. Bye.